Welcome to This Prepared Life podcast, where homesteading and the apocalypse meet. I'm Allison, your host. Hi, and welcome to episode 5 of This Prepared Life. I'm Allison, your host, and today we are going to talk about food preservation, specifically canning. And I'm really excited to do this episode because canning is such a huge part of what we do in our homesteading and our prepping journey. So we grow as much of our own food as we are able, and part of that process is putting that food up, whether that's canned or pressure canned or dehydrated or freeze dried. So we have a lot of methods we use, and canning is one of the first methods I ever did. My grandmother taught me to can when I would go to her house in the summers. We would can peaches and blackberry jam, and I just have fond memories of that. So let's talk a little bit about why someone might want to can their own food. Typically, home canned food is cheaper than buying it at the grocery store. So, we can buy food by the case from local farmers or in bulk. And that savings is much cheaper than you could do that purchasing at the grocery store. So another benefit is that you know what is in your food. You know how much sugar is in your food. You know how much salt is in your food. You know that there are no preservatives in your home canned food. And for some of us, that's very important. For people with food allergies, if you are canning your own food, you know that that is a safe food to eat. So canning, another benefit is it is a path to self-sufficiency. When we grow our own food and then can our own food and then eat our own food, we are totally removing all of the middlemen in our food supply chain. And I think it is so important to shorten that supply chain, whether that means you are growing it yourself or you are buying it from a local farmer. But the closer to home we can get our food, the healthier it is because the fresher it is. So quality. Home canned food just tastes better. The food that goes into that jar is fresher. It did not have to travel from the farm to the distributor to the processor. That takes time. That food went from farmer to box to your car to your kitchen. So that's days, maybe even weeks of that food getting into that jar faster. So fresher food tastes better. Another benefit is that it feels good. It is wonderful to walk into a pantry and see jar after jar of food that you put your time and your labor and your love and your effort into, and know that that is what you are feeding your family. And that is worth something. It's an accomplishment that we can be proud of. So let's define what canning is. And I went online and I snagged a couple different definitions. So the National Center for Home Food Preservation says canning is a method of food preservation where food is placed in a jar or a can and is heated to a temperature that destroys microorganisms in the food. The heat also inactivates enzymes in the food that can cause spoilage. As a jar is heated, air is driven from the product and the jar. When the jar cools, a vacuum seal is formed. The vacuum seal holds the lid on the jar, prevents the food from drying out, and prevents contamination of the food. So that is just kind of like a great description and overview of how the canning process works. The Hazel Atlas Jar Company says canning is a method of using heat and airtight containers to preserve food as nearly as possible in the condition in which it would be served when freshly cooked. And there's that fresh again. Home canned food is fresher. And to be clear, canning refers to a heat treatment process, not to the type of container that the food item happens to be canned in. When we say canning, we are talking about the method of putting jars in water and heating it and then cooling it to form that vacuum seal. We are not talking about cans. So, and there are several different types of canning. There's water bath canning, steam canning, and pressure canning. And today I am not going to be talking about steam canning. I have zero experience with steam canning, but I do know that there are some great articles about steam canning on the Ball website. So that would be a great reference for those of you who are interested in learning more about steam canning. So boiling water canning is for foods that are acidic or have a pH below below 4.6. And pressure canning is for foods that are low acid with a pH of 4.6 and above. So high acid foods are things like jam and jelly, most fruits, pickles, relishes, salsas, tomato products with an added acid, which usually is lemon juice. Low acid foods are things like meat, poultry, fish. If you're going to make soup or chili, that would be a low acid food. Generally, most vegetables are a low acid food. And if you are making a recipe that is a mixture of low acid foods and high acid foods, typically you will process that as a low acid food, like spaghetti sauce. You could can the tomato sauce in a water bath canner, but that meat in a spaghetti sauce would need to be pressure canned. So if you combined them into a recipe, you would need to pressure can that. Boiling water bath canning involves the removal of oxygen, the sealed jar so that nothing can enter it, heat from the boiling water temperatures. It involves acidity, either natural acidity or added acidity. And pressure canning involves the removal of oxygen, the sealed jar, heat at pressure temperatures. So very different processes. And if you are just starting out, I highly recommend you start with water bath canning. Make a batch of jam or can some peaches or make some applesauce. Those things are, while they may seem daunting, they're super simple. And I think you'll be surprised once you get started. So a good book that I absolutely just love is called Putting Food By. And they have a really great description of explaining the different temperatures. And so I wanted to read that to you. The type of heat is vitally important because the ability to transfer heat varies between wet heat and dry heat. And here's an illustration. Hold your hand in a steady, strong flow of steam from the spout of a tea kettle for 1 minute, and it will be burned enough to blister badly. Hold it in the dry air of an oven at the same temperature reading for a minute, and it will be pleasantly warmed. To carry the idea further, the 240-degree Fahrenheit steam in a pressure canner at 10 pounds per square inch at sea level has a much greater effect on the heat transfer process than does the atmosphere of an oven operating at 240 degrees Fahrenheit. So never forget this. Only under greater than atmospheric pressure can you produce wet heat that is hotter than the boiling point of water at your altitude. And you will need wet heat under pressure to reach deep enough inside a container of low acid food to destroy the spoilers that can make it nasty, even dangerous to eat. If you remember this why, you'll always be able to keep track of how in canning food at home. So one thing that quote mentioned was altitude in canning. So there is a chart, and I will try and link that in the blog post about altitude. And the higher up you go, the more you need to either increase pressure or increase processing time, depending on what you're doing. So for those of us high in the mountains, just know that the times that are listed on a recipe are probably not the times that you need. The times listed on a recipe are typically at sea level. So I will link that chart for everyone to take a look at. So let's talk a bit about the basic supplies. And I know this is a big topic. A lot of people feel really overwhelmed looking at canning and going, what do I need? And there's all of these gadgets, and some of them are so cool. So let's just go through a list, and then I'm going to tell you what like my bare bones basic supplies would be. The first and the main supply is the water bath canner or the pressure canner, the pot that you are going to put your jars in. And I have 2 water bath canners. One was my grandmother's, and it is still going strong. And then I have my pressure canner, which I just got at Walmart. I think I got my first one 10, 12 years ago. And it was, I think, $50-$60 then. And it's still available on the Walmart website. I have a weighted gauge pressure canner, not a dial gauge pressure canner. So the pot, that's the first thing you need. A jar lifter. lifter. So a jar lifter is this little like hinged tool that allows you to remove the jars from the boiling water without, you don't have to stick your fingers in the jar. It's kind of like tongs for a jar. So the next thing is a jar funnel, and this just helps you get the food into the jar without, spilling it everywhere. Jars, lids, and rings are one of the next supplies you need. A magnetic lid wand, and this is just a little wand with a magnet on the end that allows you to get the flat lids out of hot or boiling water without using your fingers. Another useful tool is a jelly bag or a strainer, and you can use a lot of different things for this. I have like an actual jelly bag and I love it, and it's essentially like 3 legs with a ring at the top, and you hang a bag from it, and then you can put your cooked fruit into that and the juice will drip out, and that is what you would make jelly out of, because jelly is made out of juice and jam has fruit chunks in it. Next thing would be a food mill or sieve, and a food mill or sieve just removes pulp and seeds from the product you're canning. So it's a way to strain things very easily. There's a lot of different gadgets you can get. You can get cherry pitters and apple peelers and corers. You can get corn cutters. I am not a gadget person in my kitchen, and I have a lot of canning gadgets because we will do cases of different food items at one time. So like my cherry pitter, I love my cherry pitter. I think there might be a video on my Instagram of me using it this year. It is so easy to use. I've seen someone on Instagram uses a bobby pin for her cherry pitter, and that looked like it worked amazing. So you don't have to have these gadgets. These are just neat things that can make the process easier. So one question that I keep getting asked is, what if I don't have the supplies or I can't afford them? So there's a couple different things you can do, different tricks. So if you don't have a canner, and I think a canner probably runs around $30 last time I looked. I don't know now. I know prices of canning supplies have gone up quite a bit lately. You can use any pot that is large enough for your jars to have an inch or more of water above the tops. You also need to have a rack of some kind in the pot so the jars are not sitting on the bottom of the pot. And if your pot does not have a rack, you can take the rings from the canning jars and just set those in circles inside the pot and make a rack out of that. That's a way that you can without having to go out and buy a pot. You don't have to have a jar lifter and a jar funnel. The jar lifter, it's going to be a little harder to get those jars out of a pot without a jar lifter. And a jar lifter is really, I think it's probably under $5. Same with a jar funnel. So I really would recommend those 2 items. Jars, lids, and rings, you have to have them. There's a lot of different types of lids. There's a lot of different brands of lids. There's even reusable lids. So you need to invest in the product that you want to use and feel comfortable using with that. My essential items are the jars, obviously, the lids and the rings, the jar lifter, and the jar funnel. I like having my water bath canner because I can fit so many more jars in to process at once than in like my kitchen, my normal biggest kitchen pot. It would probably take me double the time. So if I had the money, I would invest in a water bath canner. So those are my essential items. And I posted on my stories on Instagram a couple days ago asking people what their canning questions are. So I wanted to go through some of those, and try and answer them. The first question is, can I use a silicone rack? I don't see why not. The purpose of the rack is to keep the jars from touching the bottom of the pot and to allow water to circulate around all the jars. Your jars should not be touching. So I think if you have a pot large enough and a silicone rack large enough, then go for it. Next question, have you ever opened something and it was bad? So I have not opened something and had it be bad, but this last fall, I did go downstairs. Actually, my husband went downstairs and he's like, hey, you have a jar molding on the shelf. And so I ran down there and looked, and it was a jar of raspberry jam. And it had mold growing inside of it. And so, after 15 plus years of canning, that is the first time I have ever had something that I was like, oh no. And I checked all the other jars. They were all fine. So the conclusion I came to was we moved last year and we moved those jars of jam. So I am betting that the jar got jostled and the lid got popped off, because it wasn't like the contents of the jar went bad. It was just exposed to air. And when the lid comes off and it's exposed to air, the food will rot. Is brand name important? I'm going to say yes and no. It depends on the item. Brand name of your canner pot, I don't think that's super important. The brand name of your utensils, I don't think that's super important. The brand name of your lids and possibly your jars, I think that is important. So there is one main manufacturer of lids and jars in the United States, and that's Newell. And they manufacture Ball, Care, I think it's called Golden Harvest, and another one I cannot remember, but you can Google that if you want to look that up. And I believe the Golden Harvest might be sold as a Walmart brand. I'm not sure. And so I have heard a lot of people have great success with that Golden Harvest brand lid, and that would make sense because it's manufactured by the same people that make the Ball and the Care lids. There are bulk lids on some of like the Amish websites. I have heard great things about those, and I have heard a lot of negative reviews about the canning lids that you can find on Amazon and eBay that are typically bulk lids from China. So one thing to research for any lid you're going to be doing is, will it work for what you're going to be using it for? I read something that some flat lids are not approved or meant to be used for pressure canning. So for me, I don't want to have to, okay, this pile of lids is for water bath canning and this pile of lids is okay for pressure canning. I just want all my lids to work for anything I might use them for. In the case of lids, yes, brand name, I believe, is important, or at least manufacturer is important. So you can look into that. What types of food can be canned? So we covered that a little bit earlier. Almost anything can be canned. So the Ball Blue Book has so many recipes, and I will talk about that a little bit in the resource. But really, I mean, if you think about it, think about something you eat, you can probably can it or pressure can it. You might need to change the recipe up a little bit, but almost everything. Next question, reusing lids. So I have never reused my lids for water bath canning or pressure canning. Typically in my house, when the lids get pried off, they tend to get dented or dinged in some way, shape, or form. I have multiple teenagers and a husband, so not everyone is careful taking the lids off. So I have never reused lids. I do reuse my lids for vacuum sealing dry goods, and I am still reusing lids that are probably 6-7 years old for vacuum sealing dry goods. So they tend to work for a very long time for that. I did see a post, it was a couple months ago, I think, on survivalblog.com on reusing lids. So that might be a resource to go look for, and I will link that in the blog post for you. So here is another question from a brand new canner, and it says, I don't want to get botulism and die. That's literally what it says. So botulism is really rare. It's not happening on a regular basis. If you use proper canning techniques and you use the right equipment for the food you are processing and you use tested recipes for canning, the chances of you getting botulism are pretty slim. So when I say use the right equipment for canning a recipe, I am meaning you're going to can some carrots. That is a low acid food, therefore the right equipment would be a pressure canner, not a water bath canner. Typically, botulism happens in those low acid foods. So just, be more careful with those. And a trusted recipe and a tested recipe is one where they have tested the pH, they have tested the time it takes for the contents of that jar to reach the temperatures to kill that bacteria and those germs and those things. So that's what I mean when I say a tested recipe. How old can your frozen meat be that you want to can? I am not sure. I have never canned like incredibly old frozen meat. I do put things in my freezer to hold them over until I have time to can them. Like I will freeze berries. I will freeze a sauce I made that I have run out of time to can. And then later I will heat that back up and bring it to boiling and then can it just like I had just made it. So you can do that with a lot of things. I know you can frozen meat after you have thawed it in the refrigerator. So I think that may be a personal decision. Like, how old is this meat? 3 years old? Are you going to want to eat it anyway? I don't know. So that is just, I think, something that everyone would need to decide for themselves, knowing the age of whatever the meat is you're thinking of processing. So steam canning versus water bath canning. I touched on this earlier. I don't know anything about steam canning, so I'm going to send you to the Ball website, which I believe is healthycanning.com. Is it worth it to can if you live by yourself? And I loved this question because yes, absolutely. Let's go back to all those benefits. Canning is cheaper. Canning gives us a great feeling of accomplishment. Canning provides us with fresher food, which means healthier food. So I think if you live by yourself and you want to have home canned food, then go make yourself some home canned food. Think how great it would be come December to open up your cupboard and see a jar of just sunshine orange peaches sitting there that you canned for yourself. You can can in smaller jars. You don't have to can in big quart jars. I can a couple things that no one likes to eat but my husband. And so I will make them in quarter pints or half pint jars just so that once he opens that jar, the rest of it doesn't go bad before he can consume it. Can in smaller jars. But yes, absolutely, you can if you live by yourself. Basic tips for beginners. So I think as a beginner, I say just do it. Jump in and do it. Get yourself the Ball Blue Book. Go to their website and do some reading. Go to your local farm store or feed store and get all your supplies, or Walmart. All those places typically have them, and pick an easy recipe. Start with applesauce or peaches or strawberry jam. Those things are all fairly simple to make and they do not require a lot of prep or processing time. So start with something easy. Get yourself the Ball Blue Book, get the needed supplies, and ask questions. Don't be afraid to call grandma up and be like, hey, have you ever done this? And chances are she may have and is excited that you're going to can and would love to answer your questions. So we were all new once and no one knows the answer to everything. Yeah, just get started. So here are some recommended resources for canning. And this is by far not all of the resources for canning. These are just a small handful I chose to share with you that I felt for a brand new canner would be a really trusted resource to go to. The Ball canning website is www.healthycanning.com. And I will link all of these in the blog post for this episode. Another recommended website is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And their website is a little wonky and old and not super easy to navigate, but you can dig in there and they have a great search feature where you can like search tomatoes and then a bunch of different recipes will come up. So the Ball Blue Book is a book I strongly recommend every single canner own. They have an older version, which I prefer, but you might have to look for it used. And then a newer version that is called the all new Ball Blue Book of Canning. And both are excellent, but I really feel like the older version is just more basic and simple. And here's here's how you do it, and here's some basic recipes. And I feel like the new Bald Blue Book of Canning it's beautiful, and it has lovely pictures, and it has a ton of really great recipes. I feel like a lot of the recipes in there are more extravagant and require more ingredients. So get yourself a copy of the Bald Blue Book. I still reference my Bald Blue Book every year. Every year at canning season, I pull that book out and I look through and I refresh my memory and I read through some of the recipes I'm going to make this year. Great, great resource. The next book I really enjoy is Putting Food by Janet Green, Ruth Hertzberg, and Beatrice Vaughan. This is just a great book, and I believe one of them is a master canner. I can't quite remember, but there's a ton of recipes and information in that book. And then another book that I reference almost every year is Preserving Summer's Bounty, which is a Rodale garden book. And this one is not just canning and preserving. It has all kinds of things in it. It has dehydrating and just different ways you can do different foods. And one thing I love about that book is that it has charts of the foods and their recommended way to preserve it. So, because some foods are better frozen and some foods are better canned and some foods need blanched and most foods need blanched, but they really break everything down. And so I love that book as well. So I hope that gave you just a great overview of canning and what kinds of things you might be able to can and what you might need to go start canning. And I am happy to answer any questions. So please head on over to Instagram. You're welcome to shoot me a private message or comment on the post for this episode. Thanks for listening today, and until next time, remember, every little thing matters, and a goal without a plan is just a wish. If you have any questions, feel free and find me on Instagram at This Prepared Life. You can also visit thispreparedlife.blogspot.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would love it if you would leave a review on Apple Podcasts.